customer. You might get him through 4, 5, 6 times and think this is the best thing since sliced bread. I've just made $500,000. This is brilliant. I'll get a deal with one of the biggest supply chains in Australia, and then find out on the 100th shipment when customs inspect it, this is a prohibited item. Your business is literally done overnight. Check your products. Make sure that you can bring them in before you go and buy them. That's my number one tip. Importing basics. There's maybe some seasoned importers in here. This might they already know what's going on with the importing game, but there could be some startups here that haven't ventured into the importing industry yet, or haven't bought their first product from overseas. If they have, had a bad experience, and I'm hopefully here to try and solve some of those problems in a hopefully 15-minute period, which is going to be tough. We'll see how we go. Rightio, Incoterms. So most of my customers that I deal with have gone to Alibaba at some point. They go on there, they find a fantastic product, they think this is going to make me a millionaire. Great, let's buy it, let's bring it in. And I believe there's a FedEx person in the room here, so nothing against FedEx, they're a great company, but usually FedEx ship the cargo. So they did the first shipment, it goes straight through the customs system. Their Chinese supplier usually lies about the price of the goods. It comes under $1,000, goes straight for the customs and quarantine processes, and they get it at the door. Fantastic. This is brilliant, let's go buy a container. So they then go to the next order, place an order for a container. The container then goes through a whole different process. Gets to the Fremantle port and boom, haven't got documentation, haven't got permits, it turns into an absolute crash and burn. They do themselves $20,000 and then think, I'm not importing ever again. Why didn't I speak to you, Cos, first? So I suppose that's the biggest problem that usually happens in importing. My advice is, before you buy a product from overseas, speak to a freight forwarder. Whether it's me or somebody else out there, speak to a freight forwarder / customs broker and investigate the product you're importing first to make sure there's no special requirements around it that will prohibit it from being imported into Australia, or any special taxes that you aren't aware of that you're going to get stung with when it arrives here. We'll go into that in some more detail. Incoterms. So first things first, when you're negotiating with a supplier from overseas, discuss the Incoterms. Incoterms is your contract, basically the obligation of the supplier and your obligation as the buyer. And it basically stipulates where your obligation starts and where their obligation ends. If you're buying from China, the Chinese, in most cases, work on a term called FOB, which that says FCB, which is incorrect, but it's FOB, free on board. Basically, it means the price you're paying your supplier in China, they'll get the cargo to the ship or to a depot, and then you cover the rest, which is getting it from the ship all the way to Fremantle port. Okay, that's really important. If you're buying under Ex Works, then your responsibility is to pick the cargo up from the Chinese supplier's factory. Very expensive. My advice is, if you're starting out, don't go down that terminology. Use FOB. It's the #1 term to use on Incoterms, and will cover you. If you then decide, or your supplier decides to be creative and say, we can ship your product for you, you'll get it in really, really cheap. We'll charge you $100 to ship a cubic metre of cargo. You think, wow, that's fantastic, that's a great price. FedEx will charge me $1,000. So you decide, let's go ahead and get my supplier to ship this. This is an awesome deal. This is the unscrupulous part, which Jess has been through. It arrives in the Fremantle port. There's a backhand deal being done between the Australian company and the Chinese company. Nothing against my competitors, but there's deals that get done and you get a bill for $1,000 that you weren't expecting, or sometimes $3,000, which I've had a number of cases of. And then you kind of go mad at me saying, well, I've got to pay $3,000 for, no one told me about this is not fair. There's nowhere to go, you're stuck, your cargo's at the wharf, you need to move it before you pay storage costs, and then you get a bad experience, and then we as freight forwarders get bad names the rest of our lives. So please, if you're going to get your supplier to ship cargo to Australia, no problems with that, but just ask them for what the costs are going to be when it arrives in Australia. If they can't tell you that, don't use your supplier to ship your cargo. That's my advice. Speak to a local freight forwarding company within Perth, Fremantle, Australia, and they should be able to avoid you that pitfall. Moving on, currency, foreign exchange. There's a number of ways you can do this to buy your goods. Obviously, you've negotiated a price you supply, you're happy with the product, now it's time to pay them. How do you do that? Alibaba has a fantastic thing with trade assurance. You can obviously take a trade assurance out, but with buying foreign currency, the banks for small importers are usually going to clip you 5, 6, 7%. I've seen in some cases 8%. try and find yourselves a company like Afex, so my company uses, or a private exchange company who are out there who will give you a much better deal than the bank will give you when you're buying your goods, especially if you're spending in the vicinity of 10,000 US. Really important. Secondly, exchange rates have a massive bearing. If anyone bought goods or about to buy goods in March this year, February, March, you would have seen the Australian dollar tanked pretty hard, 10% overnight. I did a stack of dough and a number of my customers did. Everyone's crying, when's it going to come back, what's going to happen? Again, a foreign exchange company like, not getting paid for this, but someone like Afex or Oanda or whatever it may be, will help you hedge your foreign exchange, do forward fundings, and avoid that kind of risk. So it's definitely a risk, foreign exchange, be mindful of it, and it can definitely hurt your business. Packaging. So you've placed the order, you've paid the goods, your supplier now turns around and says, right, it's ready to ship. You either contact the freight forwarder like me or your supplier's going to ship it, but no one looks into this part, how are the goods packaged. I've had customers over the years come to me who want to bring in glass vases. Fantastic. Haven't negotiated how to pack it. The supplier puts a glass vase in a cardboard box, no foam inside, no protection. The box is probably paper thin. It rocks up here, everything's smashed. Customer cries, why'd this happen for? Because you didn't stipulate how to pack your goods. Really important. The suppliers will always try and find the cheapest way to pack your goods because it's in the interest to find the cheapest way to pack the goods because there's no money in that for them. But if you go to them and say, I want to spend some money to make sure my goods are packaged correctly, like people like LG does, I'm sure everyone here has bought a TV or bought a fridge in their life, and you watch how those things are packaged, foam inserts, cardboard corners, strapped, wrapped, they do that because they've been down this road many a times. Their goods get handled a number of times and don't need damages. So please, stipulate to the supplier, you want good quality cardboard, to make sure that your goods rock up here in the piece they need. Also make sure the markings are on there. If they can't get wet, make sure the umbrella's on there. If they're fragile, make sure the glass is on there with a shadow break through it. That's really important. And lastly, do not put on your box your company name because your goods will be stolen. It's happened a number of times. Shipping methods. If you haven't imported before, there's obviously the courier method, which is your FedEx, TNT, DHL. Really good way of sending small stuff up to about 100 kilos. As soon as you start hitting that 150 kilo mark, start speaking to a freight forwarder. Sorry, FedEx, if you're here. But in most cases, it'll start to work out a bit cheaper, especially if you're only a small importer. So keep that in mind. Sea freight, you don't have to send a container to move your goods. You can share a container. It's called LCL. It gets done every day of the week. It's still a cost-effective method. Longer transit time, but still cost-effective, especially sending a pallet-sized amount of cargo. And lastly, Ro-Ro, if you're bringing in big stuff, vehicles, boats, it's called roll and roll off. If you're buying caravans from over east, most people at the moment are buying caravans. They get about 10 inquiries a day to purchase a caravan from Jayco in Melbourne. We put it on a ship called a Ro-Ro. You roll the caravan off and you roll it off and it gets this end here. Real cost-effective way of doing it. Customs brokers and freight forwarders, really important. Import restrictions. So again, like I was alluding to at the start, speak to your customs broker before you buy a product from overseas. Find it, research it, but go to a customs broker and say, what are the import taxes on this and what are the requirements? I had a customer just spend $70,000 on an e-bike shipment out of China, not realising that anything above 230 watts, I think it was, requires a special permit. So if you go to 50 watts, it needs a special permit. He didn't have one. So he calls me up and says, I need to ship my cargo, but you haven't got the permit. What permit are you talking about? The permit for 50 watt bikes. Oh, geez, what do we do now? We need to apply and see if your supplier has documentation that can support it. He didn't sleep for about 3 weeks. Finally, after 3 weeks, we got the paperwork correct. He got granted his permit and we're shipping his bikes in soon. But if he didn't get the right supplier, he would have done 70,000 US. Motor vehicles, everyone calls and says, I just bought a car overseas, can you ship it for me? What kind of car is it? Have you owned it for 12 months and can we get an import permit for it? If you find a Ferrari overseas, cheap, yep, that's all great, but you can't import it into Australia. Really important thing to be mindful of. Food products, dairy in this country is massive. If you're buying cakes and it has a dairy percentage in there of egg or milk, more than 10%, it needs a permit to come in. So if you're a food importer, be mindful of that. We just had one recently where the goods got destroyed because we couldn't get the permit up before the cargo arrived. Import restrictions, if you're buying furniture overseas, I heard someone here say I'm buying some furniture for their house overseas. Great, good way of importing it, getting it cheaper in most cases, but be mindful of our fumigation, our quarantine laws over here. They're very, very strict. If it's wooden, got solid timber in it, it's going to need to be fumigated offshore or inspected on arrival here at a quarantine-approved premise. Minimum cost of a quarantine-approved premise is going to be about $1,000. So allow that when you're looking at importing wooden articles. Really, really important. Import restrictions, commerce markings. I think we've got an intellectual person in here before I was speaking to. But yes, I had a customer bring in a whole consignment from Bali of Louis Vuitton bags and Gucci bags, enough to fill 5 or 6 suitcases, thinking she could sell them on eBay and whatever else. Got to the airport, customs inspected the goods, said, "Where's the IP for this? This is not legitimate." They went to Louis Vuitton directly, held the cargo here. Louis Vuitton said, "Nope, that's definitely not legitimate, it's all fake." She lost $7,000 US that she paid for all the bags and got a decent fine for as well. So be mindful that, yes, commerce markings and trademarks are really important, and copyright as well. So don't copy people's stuff. Prohibited imports, little things you won't be aware of. Laser pointers, they're banned. You can't bring in a laser pointer anymore. Kids still bring them in and point at planes, but that's what kind of stopped it from being imported. So they stopped. Guns, you can't import guns unless you have a special permit, firearms license and so on. Really important. Tablet press, obvious one obviously, but I have a few customers who've inquired on this to bring in for vitamins and so on. They'll make their own vitamins, and they're after the whole ice thing and whatever else that's been banned. So can't. No. Prohibited imports as well. This is a real one that got a customer of mine a few years ago. Erasers. It was an eraser. I think we've all had them at school. They have a nice smell to them. Sometimes smell like food. They're prohibited. You might get them through 4, 5, 6 times and think this is the best thing since sliced bread. I've just made $500,000. This is brilliant. I'll get a deal with one of the biggest supply chains in Australia, and then find out on the 100th shipment when customs inspect it, this is a prohibited item. Your business is literally done overnight. So again, use a customs broker, use a freight forwarder, check your products, make sure that you can bring them in before you go and buy them. That's my #1 tip. Customs duty. Luckily in Australia now, most customs duty is 5%. 5% across the board. It used to be a lot more complicated than that. But basically importing from overseas, 5% across the board. If you're importing from a free trade country like China at the moment, majority of goods, probably 99.9% of goods are going to be imported duty-free, except for your alcoholic beverages, tobacco, and some other excise equivalent goods. They'll be sold to excise. For small businesses, import GST, they aren't aware of this, but when you import goods into Australia, when they arrive into the country, you've got to pay a tax on them, a customs duty in some cases, but also import GST. It's crazy. Our government charges you a tax on a tax. You pay GST on the cost of the goods that you bought, plus the duty, if there's any on that, at 10% on top of that again. So if you spend $100,000, the cargo shipped for $1,000, and you're paying your GST at $11,000. So that's a straight up upfront cost when the cargo arrives. Most freight forwarders in town will not let you have your container off the wharf until you pay your government taxes up front. So be mindful of that. It catches out a lot of customers, especially on high value stuff. Really important. The government charges processing fees. They range from $100 to $200 depending on the value of your cargo. The amount of customers who call me screaming at me saying, "Why am I paying this fee for? Why have you charged me this? This is a rip-off." I just keep telling them the government charges a processing fee to process your goods through the government. So be mindful of that one. Dumping duty. You're probably thinking, what the hell is dumping duty? But it's a real tax. Basically, our government steps in when manufacturers here in Australia who produce goods find they can't compete with overseas countries or overseas manufacturers. Basically can't compete because the governments, for example, China in some instances, subsidise the industry so heavily that the price, they call it dumped. They bring it in here at such a low price that it actually punishes an industry here. One of the big ones is aluminium. A company in Perth called Capital Aluminium. They were hurt pretty hard about 5 or 6 years ago. So the government steps in and puts a tax on there, a crazy tax. If you're an importer of aluminium and you got caught up in this, you would be would know it very well. But basically overnight they put 100% tax on aluminium extrusions. I had 5 companies go broke. 3 companies are still paying the government back now $1.2 million in underpaid taxes because they didn't pick up on dumping duty and didn't use the right company to look after them. So be mindful of dumping duties. Excise, if you bring in alcohol, it's excisable. If you bring in fuel, it's excisable. Yes, duty here in Australia is really cheap, but excise on a bottle of alcohol is around about $70, $80 at the moment per litre of alcohol. So a bottle of Jack Daniels, you're going to be sitting around at $25 in tax to the government if you bought that bottle online. It's cheap in America, but the tax here will kill you. COVID, what have I experienced from COVID? Air freight prices went from $3 a kilo in February to $16 a kilo on normal air freight skyrocketed. I had customers who were paying $3,000 and now paying $20,000 in air freight costs. That was number one. Number two, transit times. You could air freight a piece of cargo in about 2 days from China on a direct flight. During COVID, during April, it was taking 7 to 10 days. Then Perth, flight stopped completely. All cargo's moving via the East Coast. Flies into Sydney, gets there nice and quickly. Try to get it to Perth another week. So clients are starting to cry at this point. The shipping industry at that point was pretty good. You could still book containers on ships until this week. As of this week, I've had 3 shipping lines turn around and say we've got no space on our ships until October. That's a whole month of September you can't ship a container. So if you're in the importing game right now and you're purchasing goods, plan there's going to be a massive delay to your shipping. All right, really, really important. It's real, it's here, and prices are skyrocketing on importing, on shipping prices. Really, really bad. Case study, customer of mine imports valves. Old guy, great business, beautiful man, been importing valves through TNT for many a year, never had an issue. All of a sudden wanted to grow his business, took it to the next level, bought instead of 1,000 valves, bought 10,000 valves. They came in through normal air freight processes. Gets to the border, we clear it. Do you have an asbestos declaration? Asbestos? What are you talking about? Well, the customs ask us whether the goods contain asbestos. Are you aware of that at all? No. Does it contain asbestos? I'm not sure. I'll ask my supplier. Supplier never answers the question. Customs ask for the evidence. He can't provide it. Goods destroyed. Lost them completely. Asbestos in goods, they're in crayons. You wouldn't think it. I had an importer bring in a consignment of crayons for kids. They were tested at the border. Asbestos is found in crayons. Building materials, they're rife in building materials. It's getting better, but they're still rife in building materials. You're importing building materials, plastics. Be mindful if you're importing stone products, fake stone, your Caesar stone and that. Be careful of that. The Chinese-made stuff does have asbestos in it. It's a #1 cause of, obviously, cancer, but customs are right on it and they're trying to ban it. So
don't eat crayons.
Don't eat crayons. And I'm sure most of our kids here, if you've got kids, have always put a crayon in their mouth. Guys, again, thank you very much. If you have any other questions after, please ask away. Happy to share as much knowledge as I can.